Okay, everyone, welcome to part one of this discussion on the property tax is serfdom. Oh, and it is. That's all that it is. Aside from the dismally abominable, illegal, and fraudulent income tax, another tax that is outrageously oppressive and downright tyrannical is, in fact, the property tax. Most people pay this tax unquestionably, right? Just like they do unquestioningly, just like they do with the income tax, not realizing what it actually amounts to, and without giving any thought to how extortionist it is, how unfair it is, and how invasive of our rights it is. Think about it. The message is you either pay this tax or we'll punish you with a huge penalty fee for every day that you fail to pay it, with compounding interest and whatnot, even if you can't afford to do so, right? Ultimately, if you fail to pay, even though you cannot afford it, they will take your home away from you, a home that you worked hard to pay for decades of your life. And with the way our usurious system works today, you've paid for it more than 3 times over. And yet, if you can't pay this tax because now you're retired, you're on a fixed budget, and they have jacked arbitrarily the value of your property up according to their estimation, right? They determine what it's worth. That gives them free reign to take your property, doesn't it? Of course it does. They just arbitrarily jack the value up and then estimate what you supposedly owe them. Oh, just think about this miserable, rotten scam. It's pretty clever, isn't it? Without having to say, you no longer have the right to own property. No, but they achieve the same effect, don't they? The backdoor way of taking away your right to property by telling you, oh, we're sorry. Notice how the estimation of what you supposedly owe them, you don't owe them a damn thing anyway, right? You don't owe them a fee. It's a protection racket like the goddamn income tax, isn't it? You don't owe them a fee to maintain title over your property. But that's what they're telling you. You have to pay this fee or we're not going to let you keep your property that you already bought. You own it, right? But they're telling you, no, no. And they don't estimate what you supposedly owe them based on your income. That's what the tax should be based on, right? What are your means? That is a fair, just, and a free way of doing things if you actually lived in a free country. That's how it would work. If you had rights and were respected, the amount of tax, if they're going to charge a tax at all for your property, and they shouldn't even be doing that, but if they're going to do it, it would be done according to what your income was, right? And let me add, according to what your income to bill ratio was. Because just to estimate a tax based on your income is still not fair and just if you have a high level of bills and you only have a small amount of money left for yourself. You should be exempt from the tax altogether. There shouldn't even be one to begin with, but you know what I'm saying, right? If it was fair, you should be exempted. If after all your bills are paid, you only have a small amount of money freed up for yourself. But if it's going to be a tax at all, it should be literal pennies, right? But no, the bastards don't take into consideration what your income to bill ratio is. They don't take your income into consideration at all. They charge you a fee, and a very stiff one at that, right? Based on their estimation of the value of your property. Pay it or else. It's not a free country, folks. Not a free country when you have stuff like this going on. We already talked about the income tax and what a fraud that is, right? But now to add insult to injury, they place this burden on you as well. Oh, are they ever crafty? Look how oppressive this is. Look how this ruins people's lives. For those that heard my videos a while back on the Shays and whiskey rebellions, right? Might have been one video now. I can't remember. I think I can't remember if it was in 2 parts or whatever. But in any case, for those that heard that discussion, that went on right after the American Revolution. People who fought in that war and didn't get reimbursed for it as they were promised, right? They were told they were going to get a, like a pension or whatever, or they never got anything for their service in that war. Not only that, but shortly after, they turned around now. A lot of them were farm owners. They turned around now and charged them this steep tax that they couldn't afford. And a lot of these veterans were losing their farms because of the frickin' tax, when yet they supposedly went to war to fight against unfair taxation, right? And what did Washington do? He sent the military in to crush the rebellion. Not to protect the farmers and their farms, right? No. To ensure that the tax would be upheld, farmers be damned. Veterans be damned. This thing was a fraud from the word go, folks. This whole system was a Zio pig creation from day one. Anyway, the property tax, of course, as I said, is assessed on the basis of what the local city hall claims is the current value of the property or home. This presents a big problem for many homeowners, as I said, especially seniors, because very often the value of the home soars while the pension of the retired senior does not. Thus, as obviously intended, the senior is often forced to sell his or her home. I've known several people that had to do this, being unable to afford the massively increased property tax burden, right? What they worked for all their lives, now they're forced to move from the home that they loved, that they, took years not only to pay off, but to renovate exactly the way they wanted. Now they're forced to lose all of that because of this arbitrary, unfair, rights trampling BS little scheme of theirs. It is, in fact, communist to the max, just like the income tax, which is called by name in the Communist Manifesto. It's one of the planks, one of the 10 planks, right? As is the Federal Reserve, the central bank. But also, another plank is the loss of right to property, right? Under communism, the right to property is to be taken away. And so they're doing it through this means, right? They don't have to come out and say that you no longer have the right. No, they're still claiming you have the right. Just like you have the right to redress grievances in a court of law, right? But who the hell can afford it anymore? The cost, outrageous cost of legal proceedings. But even if you could, would that matter either? Because you got to be part of the club so that the rigged court system will actually work in your favor, right? If you're not part of the club, it ain't going to work in your favor, even if you can afford the legal proceedings. What a miserable bitch of a system this is. It's such a rigged game. Anyway, as I said, this tax, the property tax, is anything but fair. And it shouldn't even be something that a senior should have to share in, right? When you're working, it's bad enough that you are being taxed with the property tax, but at least you have, an income coming in, an income that used to be more fair and reasonable compared to the cost of living, and an income that would go up, right? You get raises and bonuses, so you could afford the property tax when it would be jacked. But when you're a senior now, no, you're on a fixed budget, and now when they raise your property tax, you often you're screwed, right? There's no need of this. Seniors who are now retired, living on a fixed income, should never, ever have to pay. Nobody should, but especially seniors should never have to pay the goddamn property tax. You miserable, rotten sons of bitches, man. I have known, like I said, several seniors, right, that have had to do just that. They had to move. They couldn't afford to keep their home anymore. Excuse me, geez. The air is really dry today. But I, personally have known several seniors that had to do this. And, they were miserable. They were so distraught over it, tears in their eyes. I'd go over and talk to them, and they'd be saying goodbye. Sorry, they had to leave. They were moving down to Florida where it was cheaper. They didn't want to, though. They loved their home here. And by the way, that's becoming impossible for seniors now, too. It used to be several years ago, before COVID jacked up the cost of living down there. It used to be that seniors could retire down there and live more comfortably because it was cheaper. No, not anymore. No, they frigged that up, too. Anyway. So, how can this situation, this arrangement, be called fair? How could this country be called free when you have this type of criminal, mafioso, extortion, racketeering going on? Property taxes, regardless who the homeowner is, should be assessed on the basis of income. If you're going to have them at all, like I said, they shouldn't even exist, right? It's a sick joke. But if you're going to have them, it should be based on income, especially, more specifically, income versus bill ratio. How much you have coming in compared to how much you have going out. No. That isn't taken into consideration at all. Until or unless this is done, the property tax could never be called fair or even legitimate. Once again, it is tyrannical and frickin' criminal. But where did it come from exactly? This is where it starts to get real interesting. In the ancient world, property taxes were assessed in places like Babylon, China, Egypt, Persia, Greece, Rome, and other various places. But these property taxes were much, much different from what we have in place today, because they were, in fact, based on the productivity of the land. Did you catch that? As long as the land was put to use for making money, such as, crop growing, the property owner was levied with a tax based on such profits. But today's property taxes are levied regardless any profits that's made off of the property. And indeed, most homeowners today make absolutely no money whatsoever off of their land, right? And yet, again, they're still charged. So look how the ancient world was infinitesimally, monumentally more fair than the system we have in place today, right? Again, it's still an arbitrary tax even then, but at least it was fair. You weren't just arbitrarily charged a tax when, in fact, you may not have been making money off your land. You were charged based on the actual money that you were making off of your land. Once again, most people today don't do that. They don't make money off their land, and yet they're charged anyway. How can a tax on property possibly be legitimately levied? Or how can people think that they live in a free country, again, when this type of thing is going on? The first property tax assessments based on land value rather than land productivity began under William the Conqueror in England in the late 11th century, around 1066. This is interesting because Jewish criminality thrived under William. And this crime spree continued until 1290, when the Jews were thrown out of England, mostly because of their financial rape of that country, right? Which did in fact involve this unfair tax based on property value, not on earnings made from property. So look who we have to thank for this one, too. We know we can thank them for the income tax, right? Because that comes right out of the communist the Jewish Communist Manifesto. But now we see that the arbitrary property tax based on property value, having nothing to do with income, came from them as well. A very big part of this problem, which caused the Jews to be thrown out in 1290 from England, did involve property taxes, which were extensively oppressive under William. By the year 1215, things had gotten much worse. King John raised property taxes in England to confiscatory levels, which ultimately led him, due to massive protests, to drudgingly sign the Magna Carta, limiting his power to raise revenue. I'll talk about the Magna Carta sometime in detail. It's pretty interesting. Anyway, from this point onward, taxes could only be collected with the common consent of his barons. Interestingly, only after 1290, when the Jews were expelled from England, were the poor provided with exemptions from property taxes once the Jews were out of the picture. But did you catch that? The poor were, in fact, after 1290 in England, exempt from property tax. Today, it's the other way around, isn't it? The poor and the middle class are the ones who pay. The rich, they don't pay a goddamn dime. They don't pay any taxes, folks. They really don't. The very well-connected, ultra-rich, the Zio pigs and all the little Goyim minions, they don't pay property tax. They don't pay income tax either. No, the burden is flipped on the poor and the middle class, which for the most part doesn't even exist anymore. It's become poor. The working poor. They're the ones that are slammed with this burden, right? Our modern property tax can really trace its roots back to this feudal period of English history, Jewish-dominated period. How incredibly shameful that we have come full circle, and in the so-called land of the free at that, right? Oh, no, we're not free. We've never been free. But we did have more freedoms in, ages past. Those freedoms are pretty much gone now, aren't they? In the early days of the Plymouth colony, things got off to a good start as far as property taxes went. Such taxes were assessed based on the productivity of each plot of land. Things didn't go quite so well in Boston, however. There, the Puritans implemented property taxes to pay for the church and the religious education of their children. Bad move. Regardless of one's religion, it was mandatory that everyone pay the property tax. Taxes from Boston's towns went directly to the church from Boston and the surrounding suburbs. This practice lasted for over 100 years. But in spite of the shortcomings of this system, at least people were assessed for this tax based, again, on the productivity of their land and not on the estimated value of the land. So it was still, though the tax itself was unfair and BS, at least it was fair in the sense of consideration of whether someone was actually making money off the land. Another commendable feature of this early property tax in the Boston area was the fact that a widow with children was exempted, and she was also granted a certain number of shillings quarterly out of the general tax fund. Nice. But those days are gone, aren't they? During the Revolutionary War period, the colonies agreed to raise taxes mostly through property, except in the South, where the tax system was more dependent on toll taxes. During the debate for the U.S. Constitution, delegates had grappled with the revenue issue. Federalists had pushed for a national property tax, but because of the interest of the large slave-owning estates of the South, no agreement could be reached. The Washington administration, at Hamilton's behest, along with the Adams administration, attempted to implement various national taxes that created uprisings, such as the Whiskey Rebellion and the Fries Rebellion, which was another one in addition to the Shays Rebellion. In 1797, John Adams was greatly concerned that war with France would be imminent. He required revenue, of course, to pay for a force to resist the French. Congress enacted a national property tax appointed by population. $2 million was to be raised, with Pennsylvania's share at $237,000. The tax became known as the window tax because assessors were to assess real estate according to the number and size of windows and doors of each house, in addition to a land tax. The German settlers of Pennsylvania were outraged because it reminded them of the much-hated hearth tax in Germany. John Fries became the leader of the tax protesters. Small bands were formed to search for federal assessors, who were coming to court and measure windows, right? These bands intimidated, beat up, and ran out of town assessors to the county line. Good for them. Oh, those were the good old days, weren't they? People didn't stand for this crap, put their foot down, and sent a clear message. Back off! Where's that spirit today? This country's been castrated, folks. It's really sad. Where's the real men who have any gall to even stand up and say something? People don't even say anything, let alone do anything anymore. In one case, 3 assessors were captured and brought to Enoch Roberts' tavern and held for some time. Their papers were destroyed. The sheriff went with 13 or 14 men to the inn to arrest the responsible parties. He captured 19 men and held them at the inn. When a party of 400 men came to try to rescue the prisoners, John Fries negotiated the release of the assessors' kidnappers. The sheriff sent word to President Adams, who rallied troops to arrest the parties involved. John Fries was captured and convicted of various charges, including hindering assessors in their duties. He was sentenced to death. Can you imagine that? Think about that. He was legitimately protesting an illegitimate, unfair, bogus tax, right? And the federal troops came in, as they did with the Shays and the Whiskey Rebellions. Federal troops came in to crush it. And in this case, the main perpetrator was sentenced to death. They wanted to send a clear message. We're going to tax you when we want, how much we want. And you ought to shut your mouths in this new free republic that supposedly fought to become free against unfair taxes, right? But there was much consternation regarding his sentence, and the governor was forced to repeal the death sentence and release him. At the last minute, Fries was pardoned due to irregularities at the trial. The tax was then finally repealed, so good for him. They finally did back off, but they were fully intending to have this thing crushed and to have him put to death, to send a very chilling message to any other potential justifiably distraught and disgusted citizens that were fed up with this tax, right? In this case, it didn't succeed. Sad, though, that people, again, don't stand up like this anymore, right? Do you see how government scumbags, scoundrels, they will back off, folks, when people stand up. But as long as people don't stand up, and clearly nobody's standing up today, no, they're not going to back off. They're going to push all the harder, take what they want forcefully, have you arrested, blah, 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 when they have no right to do what they do in the first place. Another early rebellion, of course, took place in Massachusetts, resulting from excessive property taxes and court rulings on farmers' debts. The Shays Rebellion that I mentioned a while back. Daniel Shays, a former Revolutionary War captain, had led out in this armed rebellion. His group took a courthouse over and demanded lower property taxes, along with more protection for farmers from foreclosure and the implementation of more sound money policies. All reasonable requests, right? In the end, the rebellion, as I said, was put down by federal troops sent personally by George Washington. Yeah. And there were, in fact, death sentences issued at this time. They were also commuted, but nevertheless, you see how, with each of these rebellions, that was their aim. They wanted death sentences issued out to send a chilling message, again, not to ever try this. Again, pay your taxes, shut your mouth, this is your duty, and we'll assess them any way we want, blah, blah, blah. Moving up now to the 19th century, at this time, property taxes had not caught on yet on a national basis. There were such taxes in existence, but they were spread far and wide. They were testing the water, right? A little here, a little there. Let's try it over here. Let's try it there, In the 1840s in New York, a tenant revolt occurred, which unfortunately did not succeed in abolishing the system that allowed property tax, but it did succeed in banning all federalism in the state's constitution. A revised version of New York's constitution following the revolt read as follows: all feudal tenures of every description, with all of their incidents, are declared to be abolished, saving, however, all rents and services certain which at any time heretofore have been lawfully created or restored. In other words, feudalism, i.e., property taxes, were actually only gone in name, while the feudalistic property tax remained firmly in place. It was just window dressing like they do today, right? They created a law that seemed to be helping people when in fact nothing had really changed. It makes me think once again of the Trading with the Enemy Act, right? Did you ever look at it? Look it up sometime. It's very short. It's only a sentence or two. And there was pressure to create a law at the time. This is during World War I, because people were noticing that U.S. corporations were actually supplying foreign countries that were belligerent toward the United States during this war, with supplies, right? Needed supplies for the war effort. They were assisting our own enemies. So there was pressure to for the government to step in and stop this. So they came up with the Trading with the Enemy Act. And when people saw that, most people anyway, they never looked at the legislation, right? They never read it. They figured, oh, well, everything's all taken care of now. The government passed a law to stop this. No, they didn't. If you look at the wording, it's astonishing, guys. And this is how so much legislation has worked over the years. The problem with this piece of legislation, though, it was very short and it was easy to see. It only took a moment to glance at it to see what a fraud it was. Now, over the years, they've learned, oh, okay, we can still accomplish the same thing, but we got to have legislation that's 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 pages long, and will hide the real agenda deep, 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 maybe in a small, footnote or something with extremely fine font that most people can't read without straining their eyes, They've learned how to better get away with their little shenanigans. But anyway, how that law actually reads, it says, this law prohibits United States corporations from trading with nations that are belligerent toward the United States. So far, it sounds good, right? It's prohibiting U.S. corporations from trading with enemy nations. But it ended off by saying, except those companies that have special concessions from the president. Ha, 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 ha. Hardy, har, har, har. Did it stop the problem? No. In fact, it helped to facilitate it because now it stated that only the corporations that had concessions from the president could do so. So now it became a monopolistic piece of legislation to ensure that only the big Zio pig bastard run corporations could engage in this kind of trading. The smaller competitor companies couldn't. Yeah. But you get my point, right? How this goes back to the very beginning, this type of sleazy legislation, with only the appearance of change in the interest of the public, when in fact a closer look reveals it's more of the same, screwing the public, Anyway, so the property tax literally makes us serfs to the government, our feudal lord. Interestingly, Abraham Lincoln, as an attorney, defended 3 parties in property tax cases. The first one, the owner of the ferry boat, the owner of a ferry boat, had moved his boat out of its assessing jurisdiction on the lien date. The assessor taxed the boat at a normal assessment, and Lincoln appealed the case in court, arguing that the boat was not in the jurisdiction of the assessor on the lien date. He won the case. The second one, this one was another case of a violation issue for the Illinois Central Railroad. The railroad was under construction and approximately half complete on the lien date. Lincoln had contended that the property was assessed as though the work was completed, but that the assessment should have reflected its true value as half completed, right? He won this case as well for the biggest legal fee of his life, $5,000. And then finally, the third case, he tried another railroad case, this time on an exemption issue, and won that case as well. So all of these were property tax related. So on the one hand, 3 cheers for Lincoln, but as I will demonstrate down the line, Lincoln was a bastard. He was not an exemplary man as he's been portrayed, just like FDR wasn't, right? FDR was a scumbag. Where do you see what a piece of trash Lincoln actually was? He's often praised because he stood up against the central banks with the greenbacks, blah, blah, blah. Again, guys, that seems great on the surface, and I certainly fell for that early on, too. I thought it was so commendable. But then I started looking deeper, and I found out how much he licked the hindparts of Zio pigs of his day, and I realized it was just window dressing. It was just designed to get some popular support from the gullible masses who were not paying attention to the other things he was doing. Anyway. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, property taxes had become the norm now all over the country. And, of course, it was in 1913 that the phony income tax was implemented as well. Operation Exploitation was now in full swing, and the average American seemed totally oblivious, and still remains oblivious to this day, as to what had actually happened. But by the time of the Great Depression, people's incomes began to dwindle. With so many unemployed, the property tax collection rates also dropped, at least for a time. The result was fiscal reform throughout the country. Many states had begun to implement sales taxes and cut property taxes. This was the period during which many homestead exemptions were granted. In 1932 and 33, 16 states also implemented property tax limitation laws. You don't have that anymore, though, do you? Income taxes, which had stayed low and affected few people until World War II with the so-called victory tax, nearly doubled as a percentage of one's income, from 11.6% in 1929 to 21.1% in 1932. On the local level, property taxes doubled from 5.4% of people's income in 1929 to 11.7% in 1932. But notice, the property tax was estimated at this time, according to a person's wages, not the value of the property, right? And even though this was a high level by 1932, 11.7%, that's pretty high. Keep in mind, there was not an income tax for most people. There wasn't an income tax yet. So, I mean, it's still a fake tax, a feudalistic tax, right, that shouldn't have existed in the first place. But at least, it was a far more bearable burden, although at that time, of course, the Great Depression, no, it wasn't. But keep this in mind, not long after this, and this was still going on at the time in 1933 when FDR came into office, right? He implemented the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The banks were profiteering off of the crash and the ensuing depression that they orchestrated, right? They didn't need relief. They were making out handsomely from this fiasco. It was the general public that needed relief. Oh no, he didn't pass a General Public Relief Act, did he? He passed an Emergency Banking Relief Act. Anyway, the tax delinquency rate rose to over 30% at this time, of course. The rate in some areas, especially rural communities, was much higher. Hundreds of taxpayer groups formed across the country to address and demand real tax reform. In 1934, the National Association of Assessing Officers was created and eventually became the International Association of Assessing Officers. Some of the major tax reforms of the first half of the century included narrowly defined personal property taxes on citizens and almost complete elimination of intangible property taxation. There was the creation of various exemptions for sick, aged, poor, for farms, for homesteads. Not anymore. Look how much more fair the system was run back then, right? They hadn't completely permeated the system with the corrupt minions yet. Creation of circuit breakers were to limit the percentage of one's income going to property tax as well. There was the creation of property tax limitations in a large number of states across the board. After World War II, the economy grew at significant rates, along with people's incomes and total property tax collections. So the burden was much more bearable then, right? What people don't realize, though, is that the economy was allowed to boom for a time because they needed to pick the pockets of the American public to fund the phony Cold War fiascos, right? Once they were done using us, didn't need us anymore because they had already overthrown non-compliant leaders in the countries that we invaded, then our living standards started to go to hell because they didn't need us to support the war effort and have us feel comfortable about it at the same time. Now that they don't need us and they feel they've dumbed us down enough, now, our living standards have gone straight to hell, right? Because now that they've conquered the world as far as its leaders go, now they're bringing us down to third world status, which is what they intended all along. During the 1970s, states that had not implemented property tax limits came under increasing pressure from referendum votes and court cases. On June 7th, 1978, Proposition 13 passed in California, limiting the assessment to current value plus 2% per year. There's your Jew interest for you. When the property sold or was newly constructed, the assessment process began again with the new sale price. Massachusetts, after years of taxpayers' complaints and failed attempts to lower property taxes, there was an implementation of state sales tax and a distribution of revenue to cities and towns in 1967, for example. The state implemented a state lottery to distribute revenue to relieve property tax pressure in 1971, only because of public outcry, though, right? Increased state income and sales taxes for revenue sharing in 1975 also resulted from this. But property taxes still, across the board, did not decline. And why not? Because they never were intended to. There were some little, benefits you could reap here and there just to keep people happy, so they wouldn't see the bigger picture that the property tax was not lowering, but instead was actually rising from year to year. But just so they could foist this on people in a way that they could more easily accept it, they were given breaks in other areas just for a time, right? The intent was always to rape and pillage, and that is just where we're at today. In townships across the country, property taxes, along with the income tax, of course, are, for millions of Americans, the absolute end of the American dream, right? Indeed, they amount instead to the American nightmare. The assessment of property taxes based on property value, with no regard for a person's income, is a vile affront, an abomination to personal freedom, and it is the very antithesis of civil decency. As you dig deeper, the situation just gets worse and worse when you start looking at all the details, right? Not only does the paying of property tax make you the renter of what's supposed to be your property, and thus the government the real owner, but under the same fraudulent, feudalistic property tax system, you're made to seek permission from the government, local, state, federal, it doesn't matter, right? To simply add an addition onto your home. You have to ask them permission. You have to get a permit, which is asking their permission to add something on. And when you do so, you get reassessed and they punish you with a fine, which is literally what it amounts to. by raising your property tax. You're getting punished. We don't want you to add on to your property, but if you do, we will punish you. That's what they're saying, guys. This is outrageous, man. After the addition is added, you will pay a higher property tax, of course. Since the addition increases what they assess you at. So who is really in charge of what you only think is your home? I don't know why I use the German accent for that, by the way. I always tend to do that. Anyways, but, do you call this freedom? They have set things up so that people don't want to or can't afford to make improvements on their homes. They've got you nailed to the wall. It's like when you open up an IRA or whatever, right? Or even an investment, you get involved in some investment. The IRS code, which has no legal binding authority over you whatsoever, but it doesn't matter. Everybody goes by because I think they have to, right? The IRS code has you nailed to the wall. They tell you if you can invest, how much you can invest, when you can invest, if you take anything out, when you take it out, how much you can take out, how much they're going to take from what you take out. Hey, 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 hey. Oh, but this is a free country now, is it? Not only is it the poor who can't afford their property taxes in the first place, who get penalty fees for not being able to pay, right? They can't pay the initial amount, and every day that goes by that you don't pay it, they're gonna raise it with a penalty fee. Oh, is this absolutely disgusting? But the wealthy and the big corporations often pay no property taxes whatsoever. The ones that can afford to pay it don't. The ones that can't are the ones that get slapped with it. And again, they get whacked with penalty fees for every day that goes by that they can't pay what they can't afford to pay in the first place. Think of it, guys. Think what an abominably wretched system this is. These shackles should have been thrown off a long frickin' time ago, as the Constitution calls for, right? Just look at Dover, Delaware, right? A city where a lot of corporations have their legal addresses, a drop box, because a special ordinance was established there by them, which exempts them as corporations from paying property taxes. How convenient is that? There are about 285,000 corporations, in fact, that are headquartered there, such as American Airlines, Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, Bank of America, Ford, Coca-Cola, General Electric, Google, Walmart, and on it goes. They don't pay property tax. And yet, they're the ones that can afford it, right? The ones who pay are the struggling, the poor, the working poor, as well as the poor that don't have any income. The elderly on very fixed, limited budgets. Wow, wow, wow. Heads need to frickin' roll, man. Originally, property taxes were not limited to just land. They used to include commodities that were financially profitable, such as investments. But the elite scum, zio pig bastards that run this whole system have seen to it that such a tax no longer applies to such things because they don't want it affecting them, of course. What a rigged game, man. What a rigged game. Anyway, folks, we're not quite at the hour limit yet, but I'm going to stop there because, well, it's a good place to stop. I don't want to start another section and, wind up going too far over the hour limit. All right, guys, more to come on this subject. We'll catch you in the next video. Thanks for joining me. Take care.